Hey everybody, this video will demonstrate how to use the basic particle system in After Effects to be able to create some simple particle effects here. So I have a basic composition, and what I want to do first is in my layers panel I need to create a, come down here in our composition, create a new layer, and it's going to be a solid layer. So really the color doesn't matter, but we will title this one particle system, whatever kind of particle system you want to name this. But we need a layer, a solid layer. So new layer, new, solid. Okay, so it fills the background. And there are a lot of different ways we can create particle systems, but in my effects tab there's a CC particle world. There's a couple other settings. We're just going to do CC particle world, and we'll talk about this one within this video here. Alright, so when I drag that CC particle world on top of my solid layer, well, I already have a particle system here. So if I hit play, it's kind of like sparks. They're flying out from the center, moving outward, gravity's taking hold of it, dragging it down. So this is kind of like a sparks particle system. And to understand particle systems, we need to understand kind of how they're created. And the first thing that is needed is an emitter. So basically a point in space that is producing a particle. And a particle is nothing but a visual graphic that we can adjust what that particle looks like. But every one of these lines is a particle, and they're all emitting from one particular point. So the emitter is location of where the particles are created or spawned, and the particles themselves are the individual graphics that are created that we add attributes to. So this particle system already has velocity associated with it, it has physics associated with it, it has forces applied to it, it has color applied to it, it has shape applied to it, that is already determined as default for us. So if you're looking for like an orange and yellow spark that has some gravity to it, well, there you go. That's as easy as it gets there. This is the default particle system. So we're going to delve into some of the details of how particle systems are created. If you look at the grid and guides, you can actually turn off a bunch of these kind of presets so you can kind of see where and how it's going to be creating it. So you can turn off the grid, you can turn off like the motion path, the radius, the position. So that way you can really focus on exactly what that particle is going to look like. If you like those things on, then sure, leave them on. But overall, we can turn those grid and guides off, so we're just focusing on what that particle looks like. That's a grid and guide section. You can turn off other things if you want to underneath there. The next section is birth rate. So the higher the value, the more individual particles are emitted per second. So it's not literally 2 particles per second. You can actually see there's a lot more than 2 particles per second. But as default, that birth rate is 2. So if I decrease that, let's do 0.1, much lower, and let that play. That's a much lower amount of particles created every second. Now if I increase that higher to 5, it's more particles. I'm just going to keep letting it play. 2 is what it was as default. 100, you can see I have a lot more particles going on. Now, particles are definitely something that you need more processing. You need a higher computer in order if you want to run more and more particles. I have a pretty decent computer here, but it is going to start to lag the more and more particles I have in the birth rate. So we don't want to just have 10,000 for the sake of having 10,000. I'm going to pull this back into something manageable like 2 or 5. That'll work for now. But you can also do 0.01. So now it's a kind of a much smaller spark there. So you can really dial this down 0.001. I don't know if there's enough to be able to see there. That's too low, so 0.05, still too low. So what's the lowest we can get here? 0.01 maybe. That might be, yeah, that might be the smallest we can get. We think we can crank that up. So we're going to go back to 2 so we can see it. Longevity is how long an individual particle lives. So right now that's 1 second. So the particle will be created from the emitter, spew out, and we'll get to some of the other settings, and then live for 1 second and then die. So if I change that longevity something much lower, 0.1, my particle system looks a lot different. And it's only going to last a shorter amount of time. So if I change that to much higher, 5, then they're lasting longer. Now, as default, this particle system also has it set up to have a color based off of the longevity. So as default, if I put this back to 1, you can see some particles are yellow and some particles are more red. The way this is set up as default is the yellow particles are for new particles, ones that are closer to the birth time. The more closer to red that particle is, the more closer to its death time, or the end of its longevity in seconds. So red means they're about 1 second or really close to 1 second. And yellow are closer to right when it was born. So if I put this down or higher, so 5, the particles that are visible in my composition are now primarily yellow because they are still early in their lifespan. But if I put this down, whoops, get our birth rate back down again. But put this down to something much lower, 0.1, they're much more darker in value, more closer to red because they're not living much long, nearly as long. So let's do back to 1, 0.8. You can start to see they're more red the further away they are. So longevity is how long they live before they disappear, go away, or die off if you want to use that term. That's how we're going to use it. We also have position and radius. So if I change the position, I can spawn my emitter. This is the emitter position to different areas in my composition. Put it up higher. And now z-axis is going to be closer and further away from the camera. I'm just going to kind of leave it on right now. Maybe we'll put this back to 0. So now you can really see they're much darker at the bottom the longer they live. Radius is the size of the emitter. So if I put this up to, let's see, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, it's a much bigger emitter. Now that looks kind of like rain because it's happening throughout my entire world. So there's a good example of how to replicate rain. 0.1, 0.1, 0.1. That's a much smaller emitter. 0.01, 0.01, 0.01. There you go. So much smaller emitters there. And you can play around with this. A wider emitter in the y-axis will create sparking effect that goes outward, which is kind of neat. Let's see, what was it? 0.25. Maybe it's 0.025. 0.025. There you go. Here's the default. So that's the position in the page composition, and then how big of an emitter it is. If you want the particles to spew out wider, then we need a higher radius. So underneath the physics is the movement that's applied to each particle after it is spawned or created. So there's a couple different ways. We'll come back and adjust. Let's just change the different types of animation. So right, first one is explosive. Let's look at the different ones. So there's a direction, shooting like a waterfall out or water hose out of a particular area. Cone axis, which that'll spew it up and then outward like a waterfall or a water fountain. Viscous, which is kind of like thinking about the viscosity or the thickness of an object. So that's kind of similar to explosive, but it does look a little different. So it's heavier near the middle, it's more sparse on the outside. And there's a couple different others. There's twirl, it's kind of neat looking. Twirly, which is a little variation of that. Vortex. So let's move it down again. So you can kind of see that vortex. Like a tornado. Put that back to 0 in the middle. There's also fire. So fire is very similar to vortex. But has a little bit different of a conical shape to it. And the way the particles kind of move around independently are also a little different. Jet sideways. Move it up some so we can see it. It's like a jet engine, kind of neat looking. A couple different ones. Fractal, omni. Put it back in 0 here so you can see this. Fractal uni. So different variations here. Let's go put it back to explosive for right now. There's also velocity. So velocity is going to work hand in hand with gravity. And we also have other things like resistance, inherent velocity, extra angles, and things like that. If I increase my velocity, it pushes it out further from the original point, original emitter. So if I put that much lower, there you go. Now it looks like water's falling because I don't have a lot of velocity, but the gravity's taking a hold of it. But if I increase that velocity, it's going to push each particle out further away from the center. So we can also play with inherent velocity. And underneath that is also gravity. So if I want to have less gravity, I could type in 0. There's no gravity. All these particles are just spewing outward from the center and not falling down. Could also add like 0.5 gravity or 2. It's going to pull that shape down more. 5. So velocity and gravity are going to work hand in hand. If you want it to shoot out, let's say 5, then it's going to push it out and up and then fall down. It's also going to make the particles look a lot faster. Here you go. So if I put a lower velocity, lower gravity, you can see they're dying off now. There's an example of back to longevity. After 1 second, they're dying off. So I can increase that longevity. Let's do it to 2 seconds. They'll last longer now before they die off. So a lot of these can be changed and edited according to your specific adjustments there. You can add like an extra angle to this as well. All right. There's a lot of other options like the floor, the direction access. Right now, we have an explosion, so that's kind of determining the direction with gravity and velocity, but we can play around some of those other changes. There's also a particle type. So particle type is the way each particle looks, and there's some presets, and you can actually customize this in more detail. I'm going to add more velocity to this, so it kind of spews it out more. Then we'll kind of pull it back down to roughly its default. So under particle type is the first way we can adjust the way it looks. And this is literally what each particle looks like. So if I zoom in, this is a line particle. That's a line graphic. Continues to a star. So every particle emitted now, I'll just change it back and forth as we're playing, is a star shape. I can also change any of these other ones. So let's just cycle between these. There's a shaded sphere. There's a fade sphere. That's kind of used for things like smoke and particles that dust and things like that. Maybe even fire, things like that as well. There's a darkened and faded sphere. So we could actually have a combination for something like fire with like the darkened and faded sphere, the faded sphere, and shaded sphere for different variations of what the fire could look like. There's a bubble. So those look like bubbles, and they all have the same colors. We'll come back and change the colors as well. But this is the shape. Motion polygon. So if something's moving faster, it's a slightly different shape than when it's moving slower. And we see the angles. It's kind of neat looking there. Same thing, motion square. Tripolygon. Things like a shattering or things like that can be done this way. Quad polygon to pretty much four-sided. A couple other ones. There's also like a cube, which is a 3D object. So it's emitting cubes in all different angles. You can see it's applying random rotation each time. There's a bunch of other ones. There's like a lens bubble, lens concave, textured square. So if you have a specific look to this, whether it's a, I'll put the bubble so we can see it. Whether it's a specific type of cloud smoke or whatnot, you could use one of the textured ones as well. Pulling your own image. But this video is just going to talk about some basic adjustments. So we talked about the emitter size, but then now we can talk about underneath particle after we determine what the particle looked like. Now we have birth size and death size. And then we also have birth color and death color. So this is the initial size that we want the particle to have when it's created. So I can actually have this much larger. So let's say 1. There goes some much bigger bubbles to begin with. So my birth size is larger than my death size. My death size could be even smaller, 0.1. So during the life of this bubble or whatever, it's going to decrease in size. So the bubbles further away are smaller than when they're first created. Or I could do the opposite, 0.1 and then 1 for death rate. So they start smaller than they grow in size. We would have a low birth rate, high death rate for things like dust and dirt and things like that are kicked up. But bubbles don't typically decrease or increase in size too much. They might float around. 0.5, 0.5. So that is the birth size and death size. Actually, I'm gonna move the position back up some, and then let's lower our velocity some. Go back in here. There we go. There we go. So we can kind of see it as it's creating it. I want to see the death rate as it is kind of happening here. There we go. All right, so back here in particle size, we also have size variation. So right now there's a 50% variation in what the particles look like. So that creates more variety so that every particle doesn't look the exact same. So if I change 100%, we're going to have more and more variation. If I have 0% variation, they're all will have the same size. So size variation is really nice. So if I do like 75%, as they die off, some of them are going to have larger or smaller size variations between them. It adds more believability to it. Let's actually go up to the top and turn our birth rate down some. Let's do 0.5. Less bubbles, so you can actually see that. They will have a drastic change as they die off with the size. Adds more variety, makes it look more believable. Alright, so we also have, we'll come back to opacity later, but as default the opacity map is they're going to start transparent, quickly grow to opaque, and then they'll live, and then as they get closer to their death, then they're going to transition back into transparent. We can change that if we want to as well, but that's a good default for particle systems to so they don't just kind of pop on and off. They blend on and blend off in their transparency. So we also have birth color and death color, and maybe this is meant to be bubbles. So let's go start the blue color, maybe a really light blue. Okay, and the death color is red, so you can see how they quickly change into this red color. But maybe we'll do like a darker blue, but a lighter color there. Closer to white. Maybe this one's more saturated to begin with. There you go. So basically the birth color will be the color of each particle when it's created. And then the death rate is as it gets closer to the longevity second, 1 second away. So we can dial this back some. Here we go. Then that death color will be the color of the particle as it dies. So it's closer to its death. So this might be our example of bubbles. Bubbles don't really fall down that fast. So one thing we can do is really crank down 0.05. And, for gravity, maybe I will increase the birth rate or longevity. Sorry, so let's do 3. We will decrease our velocity 0.01. Actually, let's increase our velocity 5. Here we go. 3. Looks pretty good. So it's like these bubbles are kind of randomly being created and kind of flying around. We can also change the animation type. Let's try viscous. There you go. So it looks like they kind of float around. 0.01. You know, 0.001. And now we have kind of bubbles that are floating around in our space here. So that's the basis for particle systems. There's a lot of other things we can do with it. But I kind of want to show a quick video of how to create particles, and then a lot of the details that we can adjust and animate over time. So talking about animation before we finish up this video, if you didn't want the particles to start on frame 0, we would just animate the birth rate. So if I want the birth rate to be 0, and if I hit play, then no particles are going to be created. So instead, maybe I want the particles to start after 2 seconds. I would come in here and turn on my stopwatch for birth rate. Then maybe 1 frame later, I would turn my birth rate up. What do we do? 2 or something like that. Here we go. So then over the first 2 seconds, it's not going to create the particles. And then on 2 seconds, then it's going to create the particles. If I wanted to stop the particles from being created and just let the rest of them kind of float away, maybe we'll have it 4 seconds. So 2 seconds of creation. Let's go to our effects, open up our particles, birth rate, and keyframe the birth rate again on 4 seconds in, maybe 1 second later or 1 frame later. Let's put our birth rate back to 0. So that's going to create our particle, or emit our particles, only between 2 seconds and 4 seconds. So the first 2 seconds is not going to do anything, and then it's going to create particles for 2 seconds, and then stop after 2 seconds, and then the particles are going to kind of fade away after that. So that's another way we can use particle systems, that we are only emitting particles at certain times. Anything with a value over here can be animated. So if we want to animate the gravity change or velocity change, we can do that as well. But the birth rate is how we can start and stop a particle system from being created during the timeline. Alright, so maybe that'll give you some good ideas, starting points for how to animate particle systems in your animations. That'll wrap up this video.